who were the worst players on the Packers last year and how many of them are still on the team this year, which means those guys have something to prove. Andy Herman joins me to help break it all down.
You are Locked On Packers, your daily Green Bay Packers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Packers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Peter Bukowski, and I cover the Packers for The Leap, a newsletter I would love for you to subscribe to. You can follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts. Wherever you find podcasts, you will find Locked On Packers, the #1 Packers podcast on the internet, and the show for fans who know what happened. They want to know why and how. Andy Herman on today's show, with what I think will be, if I can speak properly, a really fun conversation because Andy has been really good at predicting over the years. He does these grades. He's not Pro Football Focus. He just is a guy. And in this case, he's been a very successful guy at essentially predicting what players will not be on the team because they didn't play well. And you look at guys who are going to be free agents and some guys who are just going to be outright cut because they didn't play well enough. And I think it's also an interesting way to look forward because it will tell us who has pressure on them to perform. And if you think of the guys who are under the most pressure to perform this season, a lot of them are players who did not have good seasons last year or who have not developed in the way that we thought they would, young players, etc. So I think it's good to get a feel for who those players are, at least according to Andy's grades. I don't think he's going to have any crazy, shocking answers, but that's part of the deal too. And you know what? He might. And there may be some interesting answers on the good side. In fact, I know for a fact there is a couple where you're gonna go, oh, wait a second, that's interesting. So a fun conversation coming up with Andy. Before we get there, let's talk about a new sponsor to the show, Dave. Have you ever just needed a little bit of extra money, been a little short? Listen, my first job out of college, I was making nothing. Next to nothing, just enough to pay my bills barely. I had credit card debt. It was not great. It was not ideal. Well, Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. That's more money to fill your tank, buy a gift, catch up on bills. You can finally tackle those expenses that you've been stressing about without any hangups. There's no interest and no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded Dave to get the financial relief they need with extra cash. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now. That's DAVE. Sign up for the extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. And which NFL stars moved the betting line the most? We started on Monday on the Locked On NFL feed talking about the top 50 list according to BetOnline. Locked On NFL, wherever you get podcasts and on YouTube. Joining me now from Packer Report and from the Pack-A-Day podcast, Andy Herman. And Andy, you do not work for PFF, but you do dig into the film every week and do your own sort of grading system. And as much as I don't like to admit it, you have been surprisingly good at identifying essentially players who were bad enough that the team decides we've seen enough, whether it is because they draft someone or because they let them walk in free agency. This has been true the last couple of years. You have been bang on with this stuff. So that's why I wanted to have you in.
Thank you.
To see who might have some pressure on them, to see who could have their starting spots up for grabs, who just needs to play better. So let's start at the bottom of the proverbial barrel. Who was the worst Packers starter last year?
Yeah, you bet. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me. I always appreciate it. Always fun talking with you, and I appreciate the shout out there. It's actually interesting. I'll give you my lowest guy in a second, but I hadn't looked at this since I finished up my review last year, and it was interesting to see 6 of my lowest 10 no longer on the team right now, actually. So, yeah, there we go. But if we're looking at lowest graded starter, there's a couple ways to look at this.
Wait, first, who are the 6?
Yeah, the 6 that are no longer on the team. This is on a per play basis, and this is a minimum of 200 snaps. So just to clarify there. So my lowest 6 that are no longer with the team: Lucas Patrick, Billy Turner, Henry Black, Kingsley Kiki, Kevin King, and Tyler Lancaster. So those are my 6 that are no longer on the roster. Another player I think that there's a very good chance will not be on the team come the 53. That is Jonathan Garvin, was also on that list. So there's a decent chance that 7 of the 10 of the lowest graded players on a per play basis will not be back with the team this upcoming season.
That's pretty effective numbers right there. So in terms of starters, because Lucas Patrick was a starter, he's gone. So the lowest graded returning starter is who? Sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, you're good. So the lowest graded returning starter would probably be, depending on how you're viewing Yosh Nijman, would either be Yosh Nijman or Royce Newman. If those two are sort of your fringe starters, those would be the 2 that were my lowest graded that could come back and play a starting role. The only other one that would be in consideration there would be Josiah DeGuara, but again, depends on how you view starters. You're starting H-back probably, but those would be the 3.
So we think that Yosh is going to be starting out there for Elton Jenkins or for David Bakhtiari, depending on what happens. Hopefully David Bakhtiari is out there at left tackle. Royce Newman was the preferred starter last year. So for me, that seems like Royce Newman is the guy, and it shouldn't be surprising, right? Think of how we started this conversation. What did the Packers do in the draft? Sean Ryan, Zach Tom, they invested heavily on that interior. It seems like Royce Newman is under a lot of pressure to improve his level of play.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And not only that, but we saw Jake Hansen get reps with the starters. We saw, and granted that was still with Royce Newman in there, but we saw Cole Van Lanen get reps with the ones as not only just a tackle, but a guard as well.
In the spring now, right?
Yes, exactly. Sorry, in the spring in mini camps and OTAs. So it's not impossible that, we know that they're going to play best 5 offensive linemen. They're going to give everyone a shot here. And while I think there's a really good chance Royce Newman ends up being one of those guys, there's a really good chance Yosh Nijman ends up being one of those guys until Elton Jenkins comes back. I wholeheartedly believe guys like Jake Hansen, Cole Van Lanen, probably Sean Ryan eventually, maybe Zach Tom are going to get their names involved in that conversation. And as we know, again, they're going to play their best 5 offensive linemen.
Who do you think will be the best 5 week 1? Just a quick aside.
Yeah, no, I think it's hopefully Bakhtiari. I'm still going to lean that direction. John Runyon Jr., Josh Myers, and then I'm going to say Royce Newman, Yosh Nijman, if I were saying it today. But I do think there's a really good chance that Sean Ryan gets his name in that conversation as well.
I think Sean Ryan is going to win that right guard job. That's just me. We haven't seen him with the pads on. I want to reserve judgment, but I was also really high on Sean Ryan as a college player too. So excited to see him. All right. After Royce Newman, who else are we looking at?
Yeah. So again, as mentioned, Josiah DeGuara. So those were on the lowest on a per play basis. We also could look at just who were the lowest graded players overall. So that doesn't take into effect the 200 snap count minimum. It doesn't take into effect on a per play. And now we get a couple other names in there, specifically on defense, Darnold Savage, who was my 2nd lowest graded defender a season ago. And then we add one on offense as well, although to a lesser extent, even though we didn't play a ton, Juwan Winfrey ended up in that category as well. Yeah. So those would be a couple other players that we know Winfrey's going to have to do everything he can in that wide receiver room to earn one of those top, probably even 7 spots. And again, Darnold Savage clearly going to be a starter this upcoming season, but I think we've all kind of talked about, could he be the 11th best player on that starting defense now? And if all of a sudden he gets back to, he was a player I had graded very highly in 2020. If he gets back to that, then look the heck out.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing because I think everyone agrees that he did not have his best season in 21, but as you mentioned, he was awesome in 2020. If he is the 2020 version of Darnold Savage, he could be like the 3rd or 4th best player on this defense. I mean, that's the crazy thing about how talented this defense is. What is your hypothesis on what went wrong for him last year?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before we get there, just to clarify that, I had him as my 5th highest graded defender in 2020. So, he was only behind Kenny Clark, Zadarius Smith in that season, Jair Alexander, and Adrian Amos. And then it was Darnold Savage.
Pretty good players.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, and then unfortunately this past season ended up being, again, my 2nd lowest graded defender behind only Jonathan Garvin. on the whole on the season. So just a major flip there. To me, I just didn't see the same level of consistency. I thought we saw him on multiple occasions coming up trying to make tackles and just not being able to get that done again with a level of consistency. I didn't see him cover as well in 2021 as we saw in 2020. Even going sideline to sideline, at least from like a deep center field safety sort of standpoint, I just thought every aspect of Darnold Savage's game took a hit. And it's not that we didn't see the flashes. We still saw the flashes. We still saw him break on balls. We saw him have opportunities for interceptions. Unfortunately, a couple drops in there as well. But if we can get back to 2020, then again, we're talking about a totally different player and one that helps your team win and is not maybe going in the opposite direction.
I wonder how much was confidence, because he was playing with, he plays with that sort of verve that guys like Jerry Alexander play with, that Eric Stokes play with, Adrian Amos even, where they just look like they're having fun because they play so fast, they play so decisively, they play with such confidence. And I wonder if the scheme change is part of that. He didn't seem like himself to me. The touchdown with Jamar Chase is such a perfect example. That ball hung in the air for days. And he just flat missed it when it was coming into Jamar Chase's hands. Like, he very easily could have picked or knocked that ball down, and he just whiffed on it. And I was just sort of like, who is that guy? That's not the guy we saw in 2019 and 2020. So I wonder about confidence with him. I don't know. It's weird, but I think he's the X factor for this defense. If he plays well, this defense, I mean, they can be lights out. After Darnell Savage, and I had a feeling he'd be on the bottom of this list, and I knew Royce Newman would be at the bottom of this list, I'm kind of having a hard time thinking of who the next guy might be.
Yeah, there wasn't many. I mean, again, most of them are no longer on the team. Another player that was in that category as well was Shannon Sullivan. Again, not on the team any longer. So there's just not many players left on this team. I get, and that's obviously a good thing, that graded in the negative a season ago. I'm just going to go through really quickly here and go anyone that was graded in the negative, no matter how much they played. Jordan Love, negative 1.8 grade. Kylan Hill had an ever so slight negative in the minimal snaps that he played. Probably another one we could discuss with a slight negative grade. And actually, interestingly enough, PFF had, I think, a slightly above average grade on him, was Amari Rogers. We talked about Winfrey. We talked about DeGuara. Then it was Royce Newman, Billy Turner, Lucas Patrick. Ben Braden had the ever so slight negative grade. And then Yash Nijman. So there's just not a ton on offense. On defense, we have a couple more. Jack Heflin, slight negative. Tyler Lancaster's gone. What was it? Abdullah Anderson was his name, I think, had a slight negative. Kingsley Kiki. Who else do we got here? Zadarius actually had a slight negative in his 2 games that he played in. Chauncey Rivers is gone. Ladarius Hamilton, slight negative. Tipa had a negative 1.45 grade. So there's another one that could potentially be back. Summers and Oren Burks in the negative. Shamar Jean-Charles in limited playing time. Isaac Adam is gone. And that's it. So again, a lot of guys that either A, are no longer on this team, or B, are not going to probably have, primary roles. The very few that could, Yash Nijman, Darnell Savage, Royce Newman, and not a ton else.
Are you surprised that the Packers didn't add a sort of more premier version of the third safety?
Yeah, there's a couple depth positions that I'm surprised on. Edge rusher would probably be, to me, even bigger than safety. I thought once...
It seems like they're waiting on a veteran to get cut and do the Whitney Merciless thing again.
Yeah, I would think so too. But that was slightly surprising to me. I always thought Merciless would be back, and then he retired, and they haven't really replaced that. So that one is interesting. I'm intrigued by Sean Davis. I'm not going to lie. I thought even in mini camps and OTAs, which is nothing, but I thought he looked explosive, which is something. So I'm intrigued by him and to see what he can do. Tariq Carpenter, we know, is just a unique sort of player, and I'm not sure how he's going to fit with the defense, but again, another sort of intriguing player. So that position, I'm curious of. That fourth corner position. You're one injury away in your defensive backfield from having basically an unknown, whether that's a Sean Davis, who knows, right? But there's a lot of question marks in the depth on this roster that I think is really one of the bigger question marks overall on this team going into the season.
Yeah, when you have to talk about the third safety, and the caveat is at least that's something. I mean,
yeah, that
is something, but in a different kind of way. So I'm surprised, but it seems like their answer is, well, but look at this shiny Quay Walker that we bought. But it's like, okay, But if Adrian Amos goes down, Quay Walker can't literally play safety. Like there's this idea of having Quay be your sort of dime safety, but he can't actually physically. He's not going to play deep half, deep middle. I think I presumably.
No, I totally agree. I think a couple things here as we talk in that, the depth overall on defense. I think they're going to be a bit more creative, meaning that let's say they don't play a third edge rusher, right? All right. Well, could they go? And I even talked about this the other day. Could they maybe go some 3-3-5 where you've got Dean Lowry and Jerron Reed at edge with a Kenny Clark at tackle, and all of a sudden you've got Quay Walker, Chris Barnes, and Devondre Campbell as your linebackers. And all of a sudden that looks like a 3-3-5. And then all of a sudden Quay Walker swings over. And now you've got Quay and Dean Lowry as sort of your edge rushers. And then you've got basically a base nickel. And now you're without, Preston and Gary on the field, and you're actually resting them, but you're not, you don't feel like all of a sudden it's now just Tipa and Jonathan Garvin in the game, right? Where you feel like you're not quite the same. So I think they've got maybe some flexibility there. On the back end, I agree with you, but I almost wonder if even some of those Rams teams, they were able to find some safety. Like you're playing a ton of cover 2, right? And finding a cover 2 safety is probably the easiest safety to find. You're not having a guy that's having to play that center field ranging safety, not a ton in man-to-man coverage, coming up and playing in the slot. Like if that's just what you're doing, you're playing a half of the field and you're making sure that you don't get beat deep. Maybe they're feeling like, hey, you know what? If we need a handful of games with Sean Davis, we can get by with that. I'm not saying I necessarily agree, but I think that maybe could be some of the thinking on the lack of depth on the defensive side of the ball.
You mentioned Juwan Winfrey and Amari Rodgers. I don't think it's at all fait accompli that Juwan Winfrey makes this roster, even if he has been a spring standout in the past. We need to see him, I think, on the field do it a little bit more. Although I think physically he's got a lot of tools. He's got a lot of things that I like about his game. I think he needs to prove it. So when it comes to these receivers, you did not mention any of their names, which means they all graded out well, or at least above 0 in the net positive this past season.
Yep.
If you're trying to project forward, who do you think, the advanced metrics have always loved Allen Lazard, but it's a more limited sample. He's got Davante Adams to play off. Is there anything where you're looking in your grades here going, yeah, I actually think that maybe we're undervaluing how good this player is and that they could be poised for a bit of a breakout this season? That's it. That's the question I was going to add more to, but I don't want to lead you too far.
No, I think it's a good question. I don't necessarily have that player, although I will say I do think, sort of our last seen image of Randall Cobb was that last game where he just didn't do anything against San Francisco. He's coming off the injury and he, just didn't remotely look by him. Look like himself.
Right.
Right. Exactly. I think we forget before that. I had him graded in the positive in every single game that he played in. He actually ended up being one of my highest graded players on offense a season ago. I'm not saying we should expect that. I'm not saying that hey, let's pencil in Randall Cobb for a massive role within this offense. I just think we do forget just how well Randall Cobb was playing prior to the injury. And I do think we have to take that into consideration as well, right? He's older. He can't just consistently take hits over the middle. There's probably going to be some games that he misses this season, but I do think we forget that he was playing some pretty darn good football in the slot prior to leaving. So that was one of the things I look at. I've always had, Allen Lazard graded pretty well, but nothing spectacular, which I think probably most people would probably expect.
That personifies his game, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I had a really nice grade on him in 2020 where he played a little bit more than in 2021. And maybe there's a world where if he's the guy, again, that he can sort of far exceed those expectations. I think there's also a world where without Davante Adams, everything gets a little bit tougher because you don't have one person drawing all the coverage. And now the number one corner is on Allen Lazard instead of Davante Adams, that could make things much more challenging for Allen as well. So I just wholeheartedly believe that this is going to be a matchup offense where Matt LaFleur is going to earn his money by figuring out the mismatches against the opposing defense, whether that's a tight end on a linebacker or running back, spread out wide, or whether that's, Green Bay maybe doesn't have the advantage of your number 1 and 2 wide receivers against your number 1 and 2 corners, but the number 3, 4, 5 wide receivers, even against your number 3 or 4 corners, I think could be a mismatch against most teams. I just think Matt LaFleur is going to live in that realm and trying to find the most mismatches he possibly can against a given opponent. And that's who the game plan is going to go to in that given week. And I think they can have success with that.
Yeah, Sean McVay is the best in the league he had the highest percentage. I was just looking at this of times where linebackers were covering receivers. And I think that those are the kind of matchups you have to find. He does it by making his tight ends sacrificial lambs sometimes. Like, oh, hey, it's you against a corner. And now a linebacker is trying to cover Cooper Kupp. He just knows how to play with the rules of the defense. And I wonder if we see Matt LaFleur try and get into some of those matchup issues. We saw it at times in 2019 and 2020. And the point you made about Cobb, I think, is really well taken, because let's not forget the game he was having when he got hurt. Agreed. He was lighting up the Rams and got hurt on I believe on the long touchdown that he scored.
Yeah, he did. Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, part of that is because the Rams had to pay so much attention to Devontae Adams, but also it's because Randall Cobb is really tough to cover in the slot. And if Amari Rodgers is going to get some playing time, maybe you can protect Cobb's body if Rodgers can actually just be a replacement level slot receiver. I think playing him to save Randall Cobb's body could be a viable solution there as well. Andy, I appreciate it, man. Thanks for coming on the show, and we will we'll talk during the season, I'm sure.
Can't wait. Thanks for having me, and always appreciate talking Packers with you. All
right, thanks to Andy for joining the show. Great to talk to him. I thought that was a really fun and interesting conversation on the roster. I am higher on Darnold Savage than a lot of people. I think I probably would have graded Darnold Savage higher than Andy, but people like our Monday guest, Ben Fennell, also had a lot of issues with the way Savage played. So, look, I'm understanding that there are a lot of people who have a lot of questions. I don't. I think the Packers are higher on Savage than maybe the public perception is, for good or for ill. So that's just an interesting thing. And then the Randall Cobb piece, I think, is fascinating. So maybe we are sleeping on Randall Cobb a little bit. Thanks for making Locked On Packers your first listen. Now go make your second listen, the Locked On NFL podcast. Our national NFL experts and insiders keep fans dialed in with the biggest stories and the latest news from around the league, because an offseason doesn't equal a break in the action. Well, we made it. We've got a Summer Friday conversation coming up, and it's a fun one. It's a fun one. I don't even want to spoil it. I'm not going to spoil it, but it's a fun one. It's a little different from what we normally do. Not in the way that last week's was. I hope you listened to last week's Untitled 9 with Lindsey Schnell. This is going to be a football conversation. But you know, I get a lot of requests to get some more fans, more fan perspective. So hey, you asked, I answered. Here we go. Follow me on Twitter, Peter_Bukowski. Follow the podcast on Twitter, Locked On Packers. Like us on Facebook. Subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you find podcasts. You will find Locked On Packers, the #1 Packers podcast on the internet. And anytime you want to hit us up on the Locked On Packers fan hotline, you can do that, 920-341-3775 to stay Locked On Packers.